If you've been browsing the deep dark corners of the internet for long enough, you'll likely have heard rumblings of a sacred and forbidden ancient relic known as Homestuck. And upon discovering this forbidden ancient work of art, you may find tales of thousands of children disrupting conventions while wearing gray body paint associated with it, and thought to yourself, huh, yeah, maybe I'm never touching that webcomic with a 50-foot pole. But you would be sorely mistaken in making this dismissal, because Homestuck is one of the most interestingly told stories ever made. It's a long-spanning webcomic adventure that spans 8,123 pages, has animated GIFs, video games, and flash animations within it. Homestuck is a story that is unique in that it only truly can be experienced properly through the medium of the internet. Each panel of the comic takes up an entire page, and turning each page takes place within the context of the reader playing a text-based adventure game, and all character interaction is done through chat logs you click on to read. Now, already this may be a barrier to entry for some people. Homestuck is an experience told through the internet about the internet. The very format of the story is entirely non-traditional and usually isn't trying to take itself seriously. The humor that fills the webcomic is extremely surreal and meta, and may be off-putting if you're looking for a more traditional narrative that's played entirely straight. Although it does kind of become that somewhat as time goes on, in terms of how the story is delivered, though the plot itself just keeps getting more meta and insane. Suffice to say, Homestuck isn't for everybody. It's for a specific type of person who has experience with internet culture and who is fascinated by how the internet informs interaction and cooperation within the world. As I said earlier, on a broad level, Homestuck is about the internet, but on a more specific level, Homestuck is about, well, let me try to explain. Homestuck stars a 13-year-old boy named John Egbert, who is anticipating the arrival of the beta copy of a new game called Suburb, which he's excited to play together with his three friends, Rose Lalonde, Dave Strider, and Jade Harley. A lot of funny gags ensue as John struggles to find where his package with his copy of Suburb is located, but he eventually receives the package and starts the game, which is controlled by his server player, Rose. Rose guides John through the game, which as it turns out is actually a GUI with which Rose can change and alter physical properties of the real world, and is also a tool with which to escape the impending doom of meteors raining down and destroying civilization on Earth, which is also all caused by the game itself. Confusing, I know, but stick with me. After following certain conditions in the game, John escapes the meteor shower to a realm known as the Medium, which is home to a bunch of planets that our four main heroes eventually all end up inhabiting as they also enter the game session of Suburb. Throughout the course of their journey, they learn that there exists a planet in the Medium known as Skya, in which light and dark forces battle it out on a battlefield in a constant war for supremacy. It's the job of the four main heroes to save the land from darkness, which will lead to the birth of an entire new universe. Each time one of the four players enters the session, after creating something called a kernel sprite, the battlefield of Skya expands and the number of troops on either side of the war grows as the war wages on. If all goes to plan, the light forces will win and a new universe will be created. Well, as it turns out, their specific session of the game is a doomed session in which the heroes are always destined to fail. This is because the heroes accidentally power up one of the Queen of Darkness's subordinates, Jack Noir. Jack Noir gets mad at the Queen for making him wear dresses and slaughters the Queen and gains immense power and actively tries to kill soldiers on the Skya battlefield as well as the four kids. But luckily, with the help of some time-traveling trolls that are omniscient over the four heroes' game sessions and created their universe in the first place due to winning their session, the four heroes are able to create a scratch in their session and travel to a new universe that they create. They do this after a long series of complicated events, an amazing side arc involving the trolls, and main characters literally becoming gods. Speaking of the characters, there are a lot of them, but for now I'm just gonna go over the four main characters and explain what I like about them. So first off, we got our main boy, John Egbert. John is a 13-year-old nerdy kid who likes to watch obscure and/or cheesy action films, likes to program but isn't very good at it, and has scrapped most of his projects, and he generally has irrational conflict with his father. He's confused about why his father has placed Harley Quinn statues all over the house. We later find out that John's dad decorated the house with these statues because John subconsciously loves them and proclaimed his subconscious love for them by writing on his walls. Needless to say, John is a little inexperienced and naive about the world, but generally loves his friends and is good-hearted, if not a little neurotic at times. He's a great main character, and he stays pretty consistent throughout the series. He plays off the other characters well, and you want him to succeed. Next up, we have everyone's favorite lesbian goth girlfriend herself, Rose Lalonde. Rose is an inquisitive and fascinating character. She loves knitting, writing wizard fanfiction, and loves gothic horror. Her love of wizards is kept secret for a while, however, as she thinks that her mother is antagonizing her for it by placing wizard iconography all over the house. This is similar to John's situation with the Harley Quinn statues, but with Rose, the strife between her and her mother is more strongly defined and petty. She holds resentment towards her mother for constantly being drunk as well. Rose has a very strong and determined attitude about life though in general. She likes breaking things down in an intellectual way and looking at things logically and rationally. She is the driving force that keeps the four main characters together in a lot of the cases in the early acts of Homestuck, and ends up being a major source of information gathering and plot progression. Moving on to Dave Strider, one of the coolest, funniest characters in all of Homestuck. Dave is obsessed with all things that are cool and ironic. He likes rapping ironically, he doesn't take things too seriously at all, uses cool swords, and generally has a cool guy attitude. He has some ridiculous logic for certain situations, but usually ends up on the right track, even if he goes a bit overboard or gets distracted at times. He's the only character out of the four main characters who actually starts off with having a great relationship with his guardian figure. In this case, it's his bro. Bro is obsessed with puppets and runs a weird puppet fetish web show. There are puppets all over the house that bro places everywhere to haunt Dave, but they have a mutual understanding that it's all in good ironic fun. And last but not least, we have Jade Harley, who is a sweet, loving girl who is a furry. She also likes to care for plants and is generally a goofy, innocent person. She loves taking care of her friends, but can sometimes be a bit naive. Her guardian figure is her grandfather, who is dead and is stuffed beside the fireplace. Jade is very much a character who I would describe as learning about the world throughout the plot. Again, she's very innocent, but throughout the story, she becomes one of the most powerful characters in all of Homestuck, ascending to a god tier that is crazy insanely powerful and can even shrink planets down. She's a very interesting and likable character overall, and I really love her. Now, that was a very loose on details basic summary of the first 5 major acts of Homestuck's story, as well as an overview of its 4 main characters. And these first 5 acts are all legitimately incredible, and are the peak of Homestuck's quality. Never before have I experienced a narrative so unique and personal to the experiences of the characters within it. I described to you all the characters before, and they all get really well developed. Because Homestuck takes a unique second-person text-based adventure game perspective over which character the narrative happens to be focused on at the time, you get to learn and grow to really care for each of the characters. Every character initially starts off in their home, and through spending a lot of time in their room and other rooms in their houses, we get to learn fun things about them. All of the kids' houses are extremely well developed and are used as sort of metaphors for the characters' personalities. Now this may seem like something basic that any good film or any story really should nail, but most of the time this kind of thing is strewn across the background, or just used as window dressing for a quick establishing scene of a character as they wake up in their bedroom or something. But Homestuck goes out of its way to focus and make extensive jokes about the characters' surroundings and how they interact with them. This further contextualizes everything in their room and makes their rooms tell a story in a way. But here's where another barrier of entry for some people may come into play. Having the narrative spend a ton of time examining objects and doing goofy gags in the characters' rooms and houses may make the story go a little slow for people at some points, especially since a lot of people at this point have heard that the narrative gets really expansive and complex in later acts, so they might be let down and might be wanting to just get to where the story gets crazy. I never had this problem though, as I think these early sections are some of the best parts that Homestuck has to offer, and are extremely funny and show off the unique charm of its narrative expression, though I can understand how some people might not like this story. I still want to give some context though to those who may be off-put by this narrative style. You see, Homestuck's format as a mock text-based adventure game started off as a gimmick to take advantage of the suggestions section of mspaintadventures.com, which is the website Homestuck is hosted on, though now it's renamed to homestuck.com. People would originally leave suggestions as to what they thought the characters in the story should examine or interact with, and the author Andrew Hussey would incorporate fan suggestions and jokes regularly into the story. This is where a lot of Homestuck humor stems from, and is what makes it so unique as a storytelling experience. Incorporating audience participation in a long-form ongoing piece of media in this way hadn't really been done before, and though the suggestion box did get shut down around Act 4 when the audience got too big and the suggestions too hard to filter for Andrew Hussey, this audience participation grew the fan base and influenced where fan and internet culture was to become as the series only got bigger. Speaking of the internet, I've mentioned it quite a bit at this point, and that's because it's an essential part of Homestuck's narrative. This is a story that is on the same terms as its audience. It's speaking a language and is drenched in an internet culture that it assumes you already know. The very way the characters communicate throughout most of the story is through an internet chat lock client called PesterChum. The characters don't actually properly meet up in person until thousands of pages in. This is one of the coolest aspects of Homestuck to me, period. Since the characters have to have a computer or mobile device to contact each other, having the dynamics of communication be strained at points and played and toyed with is super interesting. Also, this is where Homestuck's famous typing quirks come into play. Every character has certain quirks and oddities to their typing that reflect their personalities. Dave, for example, does not use correct capitalization or periods at the end of his sentences. This gives the characters so much personality and charm without having to say anything directly to the audience. Again, it's just another example of Homestuck taking advantage of its medium of the internet in a really unique and creative way. The way the characters work together and communicate together over the course of Homestuck's incredible first 5 acts is simply amazing. And as Homestuck's story gets into the meat of Acts 4 and 5, Hussey really starts to expand on the lore and complex nature of the story. As I said earlier, in Act 5 is where the main characters launch an insane plan to create a giant scratch in their universe and escape their universe to create a fresh new one. Their plan succeeds in the end, though, and it culminates in one of the most famous Flash animations in all of Homestuck history, S-Cascade, which is an epic 13-minute animation wrapping up the plot threads of Act 5 in an intense and emotional way. This animation literally broke new grounds. All of the Homestuck Flash animations were previously hosted on mspaintadventures.com up until this point. But for this Flash animation, Hussey specifically hosted it on Newgrounds because he knew MS Paint Adventures couldn't handle the amount of people that were to view this Flash at the same time. Turns out Newgrounds, Mega Upload, and even Twitter couldn't handle the animation either, as millions of people were trying to view it at once. It was one of the most insane events in Homestuck's history, and was, unfortunately, the peak of Homestuck's quality in my and many other people's opinion. Now, notice I've only been talking about the first 5 acts of Homestuck, and have been praising their quality. Well, that's because starting with Act 6, when the main characters begin traveling to the new universe they created through the Scratch, the story shifts focus to 4 new main characters, as our previous main characters are again on their journey to travel to the new universe, which takes 3 years. The 4 new main characters that the story focuses on are Jane, Jake, Roxy, and Dirk. They are all both paradoxically sort of the children and parental figures of John, Jade, Rose, and Dave at the same time. It's complicated, don't worry about it, I'm not going to explain it here. Either way, at this point in the story, we start to see a fundamental change happen in Andrew Hussey's writing. You see, throughout the course of the events, through Acts 1 through 5, the nature of Homestuck's narrative shifts from a goofy romp examining funny jokes in characters' houses to an epic adventure with multiple moving parts and a formidable adversary. Act 6, however, takes the opportunity to kind of reset and go back to the goofy hijinks of Act 1. The only problem is, it's more bland and milquetoast than ever before. Jane and Jake in particular are some of the most uninteresting, barely defined characters in the series, and their dialogue becomes filled with long, boring teen drama and pointless meandering in the plot. It's not all doom and gloom though. There are still funny and interesting parts throughout Act 6, and the characters Dirk and Roxy are actually pretty good, especially Dirk, who is actually one of my favorite Homestuck characters. But considering Jane is the main character of this new act of Homestuck, and new era of Homestuck really, it really is a shame how little characterization she gets. Her only defining trait really is that she likes baking and has a crush on Jake, but she is too shy to admit it, and also Jake is gay and ends up with Dirk in a relationship. She honestly never really gets much characterization beyond that, and it's kind of frustrating how boring her dialogue is. Jake isn't much better either. He's supposed to have the heart of an adventurer and supposedly romanticizes action films and being brave, but he's just a lame coward and never gets anything done. Now, Hussey could have made this an interesting character trait by having Jake accidentally stumble into victory or make progress despite his cowardly nature, but it never really happens in an interesting or satisfying way. Roxy is kind of interesting in that she has problems with alcohol and is boldly romantically interested in many of the male characters in the series, later including John Egbert. She honestly isn't that well developed though, all things considered, and I really don't have that much to say about her. She's tolerable, let's put it that way. But Dirk is the most interesting post-Scratch character by far. Dirk is one of the few post-scratch characters who is interesting and funny on a moment-to-moment level, like the old Homestuck main characters were. He is much like Dave in that he likes rapping, being ironic, and is obsessed with being cool, but Dirk is also exceptionally good at hacking and understands technology. He even builds an AI of himself who lives inside of a pair of glasses and auto-responds to his friends when he's not around his computer to respond to them. There's an extremely important scene later on in Act 6 where Dirk contemplates breaking his autoresponder and breaking his promise he made with the autoresponder to make him a real living being. The reason Dirk almost ends up breaking autoresponder is that Dirk feels that bringing him into the real world outside of the confines of the glasses will cause him to wreak havoc and ruin everybody's plans in the narrative. Dirk eventually comes to the realization though that the reason he feels this way about autoresponder is that autoresponder is just a very similar version of himself. Hussey uses Dirk's growing disdain for autoresponder throughout the narrative as a metaphor for Dirk's insecurities and issues that he has with himself. It's interesting to see how Dirk has a lot of the same cool and tough guy traits of Dave, just with the added element of having them be a sort of mask to cover up his insecurities and personal feelings. He's honestly one of the most deep characters in Homestuck, and I really love him and like what they did with him. It's just such a shame that he's involved with characters who are much less interesting than him for the majority of the story. It's kind of weird, to be honest. I don't understand it. How Hussey got this one character so right and the other three main characters that he introduced and decided to focus on for thousands of pages so wrong. But the characters aren't the only problem I have with Act 6. First of all, Act 6 has a bunch of sub-acts in it that take up the remainder of the story. That's right, Act 6 is the later half of Homestuck, and it precedes Acts 1 through 5 in length entirely. It's really drawn out and too big. And I'm not gonna go over every detail of the plot in Act 6 because, again, it's super long and would take forever. But I will address what I think is the core issue with the later half of Homestuck. Andrew Hussey got tired of writing his own story. Act 6, as it goes on, begins to break away from the more character-driven storytelling of previous pages, and begins to get even more meta and subversive in ways that just aren't all that interesting. For example, at one point in the story, he has one of the main villains of the story, Caliborn, write a fake parody comic called Homestuck, which makes fun of the previous acts of Homestuck, and is a direct parody of Homestuck. He uses Caliborn's parody, poorly drawn, crude webcomic to vent about issues that he has with his previous work. For example, he mocks the fact that he can't draw very well a lot of the time, so he sometimes edits images from Google into his work and colors them a certain way to make them blend in with the environment. Hussey mocks his practice and attempts to lampshade it with meta humor, but the thing is, this practice didn't need lampshading in the first place, because it was done extremely well in the previous acts and added to the aesthetic of the comic. Hussey seems to misunderstand the point of his own work and what made it so interesting in the first place, and borderline breaks the narrative of his story to tell his audience about that. Let me backtrack a little bit and be clear. Caliborn is another one of the coolest characters of Act 6, and is actually a really interesting villain who's really funny and endearing to read. But the Homestuck portion of the narrative just basically completely makes him a self-insert for Andrew Hussey to vent. It just becomes difficult to enjoy after a while, but there are still gleams of good writing and storytelling in there. Don't get me wrong, Homestuck didn't by any means 100% decline, but it did decline by a significant amount. But Homestuck started off as a story about the internet. But Homestuck eventually became a story about Homestuck. And this is the trap that many creators fall into. When you first start off, your story derives plot elements from real life experiences and events. But when you continuously make a story over a long period of time, and that consumes your entire life, you can fall into the trap of not having anything left to draw inspiration from but the experiences of writing your own story. This can lead to flanderization of characters, breaking down characters, and writing uninspired plots. This happens with a lot of media, even mainstream non-internet created media. This is exactly what I think happens to Homestuck. And Hussey has stated before that a lot of the early Homestuck dialogue was based on real life conversations he had with online friends. I really think that he ran out of material at some point and again just got tired of his own story. Despite all this though, I still love Homestuck. I love all of Acts 1 through 5 and a lot of the parts of Act 6. Even though it went went downhill, I still hold the great parts in high regard, and I still deeply respect the work. And I think that's why I've criticized it here in this video. But I've also praised it a lot. It's become one of my favorite works of art ever. It's one of the most uniquely told experiences I think that has ever been created, and I truly believe it's a milestone in internet culture and internet creation. I think it deserves to go down in history, and it deserves more respect than it gets, to be honest, even though it did go downhill. I respect what it has to say and what it has done for the internet culture. It will most likely remain in my memory for a long time to come, and I still love it despite all of its shortcomings. Here's to Homestuck. What did you guys think of my thoughts on Homestuck? Do you agree that it went downhill in Act 6? What do you think of each act overall? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you want more content in the future. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.